Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Kovenko. It's 7:42 a.m. in Kiev right now. Today is March 4th, and we continue our daily morning reflections on what is happening in Russia, in the world, in Ukraine, and in our souls. Naturally, the greatest attention right now is on what is happening in the Middle East. I don't know what highly significant and tangible physical consequences emerged as a direct result of the strike on the building of the body where, at that very particular moment in time, the election of the new supreme leader of Iran was supposed to take place. We're talking about the building of the Assembly of Experts in the city of Qom, south of Tehran. But the entire industrial facility, judging by the photos, was extremely and severely damaged. The crucial point is that the Assembly of Experts consists of 88 of the most authoritative and respected theologians, who are widely considered to be the leading specialists in all Islamic matters. It is this specific group of scholars who are officially tasked to choose the next supreme leader of the nation of Iran. This assembly is formed for a term of 8 years, and the most recent elections were held in 2024. Again, whether these people were in the building at that moment is absolutely impossible to say. Iranian television, the state broadcaster, claims that the theologians were evacuated in advance. There is no reliable information about exactly what happened to them, but in any case, this strike did indeed take place. Now, the opposite situation. Kuwaiti Air Defense Forces made a mistake. They accidentally shot down 3 American fighter jets. A classic case of so-called friendly fire. The total number of US military personnel who have been killed in this conflict is 6 individuals. That is the latest information available as of this evening. The military expert Sergei Maratovich Grabsky told me something interesting. He strictly forbade calling what is happening right now in the Middle East a war. But somehow I simply cannot find a way to agree with that assessment. Well, I understand, yes, he's a military expert. He uses very precise terminology. He considers it a military operation. But something inside me protests, and I just can't help but speak my mind. I call what's happening a war. I can't call it anything else. A military operation. All right, fine. While many seasoned and professional experts call it a military operation, I will continue to call exactly what is unfolding right now on the ground, when innocent people are really dying, when so many lives are being lost in a tragic way. Everything that is currently unfolding truly has such a profound and significant impact on the world. It seems to me that this is very much a full-scale war. Naturally, everything that is currently happening is being heavily influenced by what the person who has now become the central figure in this ongoing war says. And of course, I am referring to Donald Trump. Here are some of the specific statements he made during his recent detailed conversations with various journalists. For instance, he explicitly reported that, furthermore, there was also a significant story circulating that Marco Rubio had mentioned that it wasn't Netanyahu who was actually the initiator, it was this very war. It was he who pushed Trump. But Trump himself gives a completely different interpretation. He responded that no, this occurred specifically when he was asked who, in this pair, was actually the main leading figure. And Donald Trump said no, it was really me who was the one who pushed Israel. We were negotiating with these madmen, and I got the impression that they would attack us first. Well, by madmen, I mean Iran. That's it. And so if anyone was pushing anyone to do something, it was me, said Donald Trump. That is how it happened. Then, when he was asked about the interim results, he stated that virtually every single thing had been destroyed. it remains quite unclear who continues to launch rockets if every single thing has been destroyed. When he was questioned specifically about the absolute worst case scenario in this war, he said the absolute worst case scenario is if we continue doing exactly what we're doing now, and then another individual who is equally dangerous comes to power shortly afterwards. As for the question of who exactly might rise to power after that, in the beginning of this process, Trump said, "We remember very well, as we keep a detailed and continuous record of his statements, not because we particularly enjoy it, but because it's important. And I do not necessarily share the sentiments and opinions expressed by many of my colleagues, which are also held by Mikhail Valentinovich. Sava says that we shouldn't listen to what Trump says. Well, somehow we shouldn't listen. It's important. This is what's going on in the mind of the most influential person on earth. So, previously, Donald Trump stated that he knew 3 people whom he would like to appoint to replace the supreme leader who was eliminated. But now he's already saying that most of the people many who might have been able to succeed Iran's supreme leader have already passed away. And then he says, enough. Soon we will not recognize a single person at all. It is very stormy. Trump lashed out. The British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Because Keir Starmer had initially refused to take this path, specifically allow him to use the strategic British military base on the island. Diego Garcia. He was indignant and expressed his frustration that he still unfortunately had to fly for many more hours because what's going on? It's outrageous. It's like some kind of virus. So he was furious and outraged that because of this he has to endure a very long and grueling flight. Well, as for Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he said he's no Winston Churchill. Well, indeed, the last name is different and he's a different person. But Keir Starmer, just so we can provide a more objective picture of the situation, Starmer explained that the primary reason for the refusal was rooted in historical memory. Well, I am attributing these specific words to him, but the underlying meaning is exactly that. It is the complicated story with Iraq when, in the United Kingdom and other NATO countries, they supported the United States of America, and as a result, things didn't turn out quite as they had hoped. That was it. This story became a cautionary and sobering moment, showing that it's not always necessary to support the United States everywhere and in everything. But nevertheless, Trump was outraged. So to put it in simpler terms, well, there's a lot there. Trump made a series of highly interesting and noteworthy statements that are certainly worth paying attention to. For example, during a recent discussion, he commented on the Chagos archipelago, where he dismissively referred to them as just a bunch of stupid islands, which at one time the United States of America gave to the United Kingdom. The question remains as to how the 47th President of the United States learned the method to measure the IQ of islands. That really is curious. As a sociologist, as a social psychologist, I find it interesting. I would like to know how to do that too. Well, besides that, of course, Trump lashed out at Spain, but in a completely different way. Not like he did with the United Kingdom. That is, the United Kingdom refused to provide bases. Well, here he limited himself to saying that Keir Starmer is not Winston Churchill, which of course is very important, but not exactly critical. I think Keir Starmer appears to feel quite comfortable in his own body. Overall, he is quite relaxed, and being in Churchill's dead body would certainly be an incredibly uncomfortable experience for him. But when it comes to the situation in Spain, that is a completely different matter altogether. As a matter of fact, he has already issued orders to his financier, Scott Besson, to immediately cut all ties with Spain. He said that in general, if we wanted to, we would have used that base anyway. We would have just flown in and landed right on top of it. But they were unfriendly, and that's why we don't want to have anything to do with Spain. So, in general, he got angry, very angry at Spain. Now then, well, let's step away from Donald Trump's recent rhetoric for a moment, and I'm noting it because it's important, because I really have to repeat that one of the major problems of this current war, which I personally consider to be very justified and very timely, is that its main problem is that it is unfortunately being led by a complete fool. That's bad. That's it. Now, as for the prospects that are emerging right now, so the future prospects are as follows. From today's standpoint, as I currently see it, the prospects look exactly like this. This regime, which was the predecessor of the discontinued, the leadership of the Islamic Republic, specifically Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and his successor, the recently eliminated Ayatollah Khamenei, both representing the core ideological pillars of the regime, is the one who actually created this very regime, its institutions, in such a way that this specific regime can survive major wars, can survive targeted assassination attempts, and can survive strategic decapitation strikes. So, when we discuss the concept of a personalist regime, we must consider that despite the fact that the authority of Iran's supreme leader is truly extraordinary, he essentially possesses the absolute fullness of power. He can veto any decision, and he personally appoints individuals to all key positions. Nevertheless, it is it is personalist, but perhaps not entirely personalist in the strictest sense. Because, well, look, for example, at Bashar al-Assad's highly personalist regime in Syria. In that specific case, if Assad is gone, the entire regime is gone with him. Take Gaddafi's regime, for example. If Gaddafi is gone, to put it more specifically, the entire political regime often collapses instantly as a direct result of the sudden elimination or exile from power of the personalist leader. When we turn our attention toward the Iranian regime, we find ourselves looking at a completely different story altogether. At this point, I will attempt to explain exactly what I mean by that statement. To do so properly, I find it necessary to introduce into the field of political science a specific kind of concept that geological term is viscosity. Now, I'll try to explain what I mean. That is to say, the original founding fathers of the theocratic regime successfully established and constructed a state system based on an extraordinarily intricate and highly complex intertwined network of various political, military, security, and perhaps most significantly of all, religious institutions. Their powers overlap with each other. To put it in another way, this complex interpenetration occurs when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps acts as a security force and at the same time operates as a massive economic structure, a financial structure, and simultaneously a religious structure. This is precisely how they maintain their firm hold on power. This is the specific way they persist and thrive. These foundational structures, representing the very institution of the theocratic regime itself, are carefully engineered to survive through wars and political assassinations. I think it's appropriate to use a term from geology and political science. That specific term refers to the viscosity of the regime. It is simply because I have been working quite extensively at the Mineralogical Museum for over 2 years now, and I have truly gotten into the subject. These complex geological terms, along with various specialized terms from mineralogy and petrology, have really had a profound influence on the way that I speak and think about the world around me. And so the viscosity of rocks as a fundamental physical characteristic is their inherent ability to resist deformation under load. It is clearly demonstrated through phenomena such as creep, plasticity, and their overall resistance to structural destruction. And so, at one time, there is the Mohs scale of hardness. The hardest mineral is diamond, but it is surprisingly brittle. That is, hardness and viscosity are things that are absolutely uncorrelated, entirely unrelated. In other words, even the hardest minerals can be very brittle. In scientific terms, viscosity is defined as the inherent ability of a substance to resist any external influence or deformation. For example, some of the most viscous and incredibly dense rocks found in nature are quartzites. Other examples include basalts, diabases, and gabbro. These specific types of rocks are known to be very difficult to break apart or crush under pressure, even with a sledgehammer. I've actually done this myself, so I understand what we're talking about. For example, take a rock like asbestos. It seems very soft as a mineral, very soft, but it's viscous. Just try breaking it with a sledgehammer. It, so to speak, it yields, it deforms, but it doesn't break apart. And the structure of the theocratic system of government, the structure in Iran is built in such a specific way that it deforms. It, so to speak, constantly changes under heavy blows. Under the relentless blows of this massive American-Israeli sledgehammer, it loses many of its individual components, but it simply doesn't break apart. So, you see, it's not a brittle diamond, it is more like resilient quartz. What is the basis of this regime's resilience? It's the IRGC. So once again, we are looking at this kind of complex structure. Roughly 200,000 actual militants and deeply devoted religious fanatics who are, at the same time, incredibly heavily armed with modern weaponry, and at the same time, they are religious fanatics, but they are also the very same people who exert total control over the entire local economy and its resources. Plus 700,000 reservists. Plus, there is also this massive volunteer paramilitary organization known as the Basij, which stands at the very forefront of the regime. This group is the one that takes on the main blow in suppressing internal dissent. Altogether, they consist of about 500,000 active members across the nation, volunteers. Then there's also the religious component involved. This spiritual connection, this religious bond, it also inherently includes the powerful ideology of martyrdom. So, if someone dies for the cause, that's considered wonderful because he is a martyr. That is, you see the core of the belief. Do you remember back when I showed you that during the time of the morning Sunday broadcast, I was required to create an entirely different episode at 7:40? In that particular video, I made a point to show you that emotional TV host who was crying right there on the screen. And there, well, obviously most of us here don't speak the Farsi language, but I later took the time to look up the official translation. And he spoke in such profound terms, saying that Khamenei had finally drunk from the sweet cup of martyrdom. And this is yet another crucial element to consider. The very idea of martyrdom that deeply permeates this entire political regime. When someone is killed, that's good, that's actually great. He became a martyr. That is why, taking everything into account, I truly believe that these strategic strikes and this targeted removal of the top-level leadership are going to be very significant. Will not destroy the regime in any way. Something else is needed here. Other technologies must be used to eliminate the regime. Such a task is actually being set. But apparently, Iran, of course, would like to achieve this because the existence of this regime is a mortal threat to Iran. But as for the Americans, they have already abandoned the goal of regime change. They constantly talk about this. Everyone, both Hexit and Trump, no longer advocate for the idea of regime change in the list of main objectives. So the likelihood that the regime will survive is very high. Now, A truly significant and essential question that we need to consider is exactly how, in this situation, what is currently happening now in the Middle East will definitely affect on the fate of the brutal war that Putin is currently waging against Ukraine. Well, I think, first of all, there is a very direct impact right here. First of all, I definitely believe that what happened in the Middle East is good for Ukraine. Why? Because, after all, the main ally, the most significant military ally of Putin is currently the nation of Iran. It will be weakened in any case, and this will undoubtedly have a significant impact. But as we look further down the road, I think that as this war continues and as the total length of the conflict continues to grow, the various effects will start to be felt in the other direction as well. These events, first of all, because the United States of America, simply physically, since they are now spending a huge number of missiles, including, specifically, we are talking about air defense missiles. They are now highly improbable to be capable of selling weapons to Ukraine in the massive quantities that were originally promised. That is to say, this situation will most likely create even more severe and complicated challenges regarding weapon shortages for Ukraine. This, of course, is bad. Here we see there is a certain sense of ambivalence regarding this impact. So, moving forward, the main topic of today's discussion will focus specifically on the complex ways in which this ongoing war is currently affecting the nation of Russia both economically and socially. The Kremlin administration responded in a very serious and concerned manner regarding the recent events surrounding the Islamic Republic of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Moreover, they responded in a manner that was much more serious, far more harshly, and with a greater sense of alarm to the elimination of Khamenei than they did, for example, to what happened with Nicolas Maduro. That is, even the official statement from the Foreign Ministry contained very harsh criticism of the United States of America and Israel. In other words, it's a horror. What is truly quite funny, of course, is that in this rhetoric from the Foreign Ministry officials, they practically repeat word for word what we have already heard from them. At one time, the Western community in 1922 accused Russia itself of the same thing in connection with its invasion of Ukraine. So, regarding Putin, here it is quite important to note that Putin personally, he doesn't actually make any particular criticism of either Trump or Netanyahu, primarily because it is very clear that he wants to maintain strong, positive relations with both Trump and Netanyahu in the future. Well, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is no longer shy. That is, the rhetoric differs at different levels. Putin broadly expresses his criticism in a more general sense, that sometimes we don't want to live honestly. In general, without naming names. Well, Amid, Zakharova, Lavrov, here they, as they say, don't mince words. Here, in fact, the significant impact of what is happening in Iran on the Kremlin is quite clearly and obviously felt. That is, it is obvious that the Kremlin's reputation has plummeted quite significantly. I couldn't help Assad, well, the only thing was that I took him away. Couldn't help Maduro, couldn't even get him out. And couldn't help the supreme leader of Iran in any way. And the long-standing notion that Russians don't abandon their own has gradually evolved into a decidedly more comical tone. That is, I think that when looking at the big picture, the long-term repercussions for Russia of what is currently unfolding right before our eyes, they are complex and deeply multifaceted. Well, first of all, to say that Putin will somehow reflect on this and stop the war against Ukraine? Of course not. Quite the opposite, in fact. For him, this ongoing conflict is already rapidly becoming a critical matter of life and death, because he has clearly seen that if the United States has the capability, they will simply take extremely decisive and forceful action to deal with their opponents. Ultimately, when we look at the final outcome, and there is absolutely no doubt that Putin clearly understands that if the Americans now find themselves becoming deeply entangled in this very protracted war in the Middle East, it will significantly weaken the overall pressure on Russia in Ukraine. Well, in fact, it really must be said that despite a certain deep-seated stubbornness and a persistent thick-headedness often seen in the Russian regime and among its inhabitants, they nevertheless manage to react very quickly to any changes that occur. For example, when it appeared that Maduro might be overthrown, they immediately moved to establish new diplomatic relations to protect their interests. The Russian authorities instantly established relations with the new president, Rodriguez. So they tried to maintain them in exactly the same way. After the elimination of Assad's regime, Russia immediately began to build relations with the new leader. We well remember that the new leader of Syria was invited to visit the Kremlin, personally shook hands, and posed for photographs with Putin. So, broadly speaking, it's not really in the new leader's interest to quarrel with the Kremlin regime either. That is, after all, because Russia reacts quite quickly when faced with such sudden changes in the geopolitical situation. And of course, in the specific case of what is happening right now with Iran, they adapt almost instantly. They will be kissing and hugging the new leader just the same as they did before. It is a very calculated and rapid adjustment to the new reality. So, in this sense, Russia always abandons its own. That's it. I think that Russia will do everything to preserve its interests in Iran and the Middle East in general. So, regarding this dark pact of murder, well, this represents the very first case of the killing of a foreign leader, and of course, for Putin, it comes as a profound shock. I think that if before this event something was a shock for him, witnessing the brutal footage of the last 40 minutes of Muammar Gaddafi's life, it's truly a deeply disturbing and heavy scene to behold, especially for someone who is currently in that same role. In fact, a dictator just like himself, the same kind of ghoul, though on a much larger scale than Muammar Gaddafi, it's clear that he involuntarily or deliberately extrapolates all of this onto himself. Well, it is well known from many different sources that the elimination of Muammar Gaddafi had a significant psychological impact on Putin. A great many people have frequently discussed this matter in detail, especially those who had any sort of personal or professional connection to that ghoul. So, when I consider the situation, I think that the primary impact on him is that, well, it clearly demonstrates to the world that it is indeed entirely possible to eliminate a sitting head of state. It is quite obvious that at this point, the overall probability that the same thing will happen to him as happened to the supreme leader of Iran is extremely unlikely at this stage. Trump clearly won't do that. I think that Ukraine won't do it for now either. Well, and pretty much everyone else in general won't do it simply because they just won't. Therefore, it really seems to me that this has had a significant impact on the way things are going on Putin, but unfortunately there is still no direct threat at this point. I will continue to work diligently to shift the Overton window in favor of the idea that the removal of Vladimir Putin from power is, first, a strategically and absolutely legal move, second, a highly promising endeavor, and third, fundamentally, the cheapest and simplest way to finally end this war.